The fifth most popular podcast on Spotify last year was Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO. The YouTube version has almost 13 million subscribers. And at the end of last month, he did an episode entitled, "Is Not Believing in God Doing More Harm Than Good?" Is not believing in God doing more harm than good? Bartlett starts with a statistic that 9 in 10 young people in the UK believe that their life is lacking meaning. As a result, he says, a lot of people are turning back to religion. There is something going on. And the 3-hour episode goes on to talk about the meaning crisis or the purpose crisis. Bartlett gives the example of a 35-year-old friend in Dubai. This friend was single and worked from home. 6 months ago, he told his friends that he couldn't get out of bed anymore. Fast forward to today, and he's become a Christian. He's got baptized. And suddenly, Bartlett says his life has purpose and meaning again. He's a completely different person. And this is despite him being the last person you would ever think would be religious. Bartlett gives the example of another friend in her early 30s, again with no kids and who works from home. When he asked her what the meaning and purpose of her life was, she replied that she wanted to reach a total of 200 plants that she could water. And she had names for all of them. A week later, she told him she was in therapy because she felt lost and stuck in life. And so he invited a Christian, an atheist, and a psychiatrist onto his podcast to discuss it all. Bartlett himself went through what he calls a new atheist baptism at the age of 18. He read all the books. He was such a staunch atheist that he was stopping dog walkers in the street to debate them about God. But he said, I now find myself in the position where I'm almost back to being curious again. And many are feeling something similar. People are detecting a vibe shift. Bartlett says there is something going on. And other people are noticing the same thing. I have a friend from school who's a few years older than me. He's currently a pastor in Wales. He's seen more than 50 people baptized in his ordinary local church. Many of them said that someone told them about Jesus and they really wanted to hear, or they were invited to church and they really wanted to come. And this is in a majority atheist area. We too have seen people coming here who haven't been at church in decades. There seems to be something going on. I want to speak tonight in particular to two categories of people and to the rest of us as we minister to them. Firstly, to those who used to go to church but have walked away, but are wondering if they can come back. Perhaps they remember some of the Bible stories from Sunday school, but their lives have gone in a very different direction. And then secondly, I want to speak to those for whom this is completely new. Maybe some who'll listen back later, who've never been in a church before, who don't know anything about God or the Bible. And I want to do so tonight based on the book of Ruth. In the first part of the Bible, there's this beautiful little book called Ruth. It's only 4 chapters long. But one of its big themes is coming back to God. The first chapter uses the word return 12 times. And yes, it's describing a physical journey, but it's describing something more than that. It's describing coming back to God. And the book of Ruth has 3 main characters. One who grew up knowing about God, but who had made poor decisions in her life and had suffered the consequences, and probably assumed that God was finished with her. The second character grew up knowing nothing about God. She worshipped other gods, but she came to trust in him and became part of his people. And the third character is a man who represents Jesus. He was Jesus' great, however many greats grandfather in human reckoning. And he shows us by his character, by his actions, what Jesus would be like when he came. So two characters who come back to God or come to God for the first time after being far from him. And then one character who represents Jesus and so shows us what the God we return to is like. So hopefully you can see the relevance of a book like this, where you have one character who thought she had burned her bridges with God, and her name is Naomi. One character who hadn't been brought up with God at all, but chose to commit her life to him. And one character who shows us what God is like, and his name is Boaz. We live in a society where many people have been brought up with some idea of God. We've had a number of people in their 50s who've come back to church, having been sent to Sunday school when they were young, but having gone their own way ever since, yet finding it hasn't brought them joy or peace. And they've come back to God. But there are also people in our society who've been brought up with no connection to church at all. And so this is all totally new to them. The first type of person often wonders, can I come back to God? Will God have me back? Well, the second type of person often wonders, is this for someone like me? I'm an outsider. I haven't been brought up with it. Maybe it's not for people like me. And the answer to both of them is yes, you can come. Yes, you can come back. Yes, you can come for the first time as a complete outsider. Because everyone's got to start somewhere. And no one is too far gone. So let's set the scene and then meet the three main characters. We'll focus on these two women from very different backgrounds whose lives were transformed. But as we meet them, we'll also encounter the man who changed everything for them and who points us to Jesus. But first, let's set the scene, because the story begins with a famine. Ruth 1, verse 1, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And those opening words of the book are very significant, because they're not just telling us when this story took place. The days when the judges ruled, it's not just giving us a date, it's also telling us what the spiritual condition was like at the time. In other words, if we were to ask, as the book of Ruth begins, was this a time when a lot of people were interested in God? We would have to answer no. It was the days of the judges. Not courtroom judges, but judges as in military leaders. Before God's people had kings, they were ruled by judges. God would raise up a judge to lead his people. And boys and girls, maybe you've heard of some of the judges: Deborah, Samson, Gideon. So God would raise up a judge to lead the people, and they would follow God for a while. But as soon as the judge died, they would forget about God again. And if you want to know what the days of the judges were like, all you have to do, if you have a Bible, is turn back to the previous page. So if you have a Bible and you're in the book of Ruth, all you have to do is turn back one page to the book of Judges. Judges is a brutal book of the Bible in many ways. And it finishes with the words, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So it was a day much like our own. Everyone does what is right in their own eyes. But did it bring them happiness? Well, it certainly doesn't bring happiness today. Stephen Bartlett said the following on his podcast the other week. It appears to me that freedom, independence, be your own boss, the glamorization of do it your way is failing people in some way. And actually the push for independence was in some way some kind of lie. So be your own boss, do it your own way. It's just another way of saying do what is right in your own eyes. And so our society is like the days of the judges. And yet, as Bartlett says in something that went out to potentially 13 million people a couple of weeks ago, it is a lie. It doesn't give the satisfaction that it promises. And turning away from God brought consequences. Still, even in that first verse, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Now, in the UK and Ireland, we can still, by our collective memory, just about remember how devastating a famine can be. But for God's people living in the Promised Land, the famine had added significance because it was a sign of God's judgment. Leviticus chapter 26. If you will not listen to me and will not do all these commandments, I will punish you for your sins 7 times over. Your strength will be spent in vain because your soil will not yield its crops, nor will the trees of the land yield their fruit. So it was a time when people were doing what was right in their own eyes. So famine should have been a wake-up call, a call to turn back to God. But how did Naomi's family react? They react not by repenting, but by leaving. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now for us today, there wouldn't be anything necessarily wrong with leaving a place when times were tough to go somewhere else where we could find a better standard of living. But in those days, to leave the Promised Land was to turn away from God. And what about the destination? What about Moab? Well, they were pagans, the Moabites. They worshipped the god Chemosh, sometimes by human sacrifice. They also worshipped the god Baal Peor, which involved cult prostitution. Deuteronomy 23 says, "No Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation." It says, "You shall not seek their peace or prosperity all your days forever." So how are we to understand Elimelech's decision to leave the Promised Land and go to Moab? Are we to understand it as a neutral thing? Well, surely not. Surely we're meant to understand it as a bad move. Literally and spiritually a bad move, a sinful, faithless decision. What is being pictured for us here is a family turning away from God. A crisis comes, and rather than letting it drive them back to God, they turn further from Him. So that's the background of the 3 main characters of the book. We'll come now to look at the first character, and she is Naomi. And as we look at Naomi, we'll fast forward 10 or more years from her family's decision to go to Moab. So how has that worked out for them? Imagine it's a TV show and the cameras have followed them as they moved to Moab. Then 10 years later they come back. How has it worked out? Well, for a start, those 10 plus years have passed and they're still there. It's interesting that verse 1 says they went to sojourn in the land of Moab. It wasn't meant to be a permanent move. And often when people stop going to church, they don't mean it as a permanent decision. And yet before they know it, 10 years have passed. Look at the end of verse 2. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. In verse 4, they're no longer sojourning in Moab, they're living there. And the months become years, and soon a decade has flown past. It was only meant to be temporary. But the temporary soon becomes permanent. The exception becomes the norm. And how's the move worked out for them? Well, it certainly hasn't improved their lives. Naomi loses first her husband and then her 2 sons. They thought going to Moab would make things better, but it actually makes them worse. And how many people around us are there who've thought that going away from God would make things better? But it hasn't. And maybe you've gone to Moab. Perhaps you were brought up in the church and you were taught the Bible, but you've gone away from it. How's it worked out for you? Well, perhaps you're here tonight because it hasn't worked out well, and you're wondering if there's a way back. Maybe you've heard that others have come back. Maybe that was what brought you through the door for the first time. Because Naomi had heard, verse 6, that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. And maybe you've heard that God has something good for those who come back to him, that he has blessed others. And you wonder whether you can experience that too, or whether it's too late. Now, Naomi, for her part, seems to think that it's too late. Yes, she comes back to Bethlehem, but when she does so, the people hardly recognize her. The women have to ask, is this Naomi? And when she speaks, she speaks as a woman who thinks that God is finished with her. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? As the next chapter begins, it seems like Naomi is frozen. She may have finally belatedly come back to the promised land, but she still doesn't see much future. She's existing, but that's about it. Ruth, her foreign daughter-in-law, who's returned with her and who is completely new to Bethlehem, is the one taking the initiative and going out into the fields to glean. And yet by the end of chapter 2, Naomi's outlook has completely changed. In chapter 2, verse 19, she's astonished at the haul that Ruth brings home from her days gleaning in Boaz's field. Gleaning being picking the barley around the edges of the field that God's law said to leave for the poor people. But Boaz, like Jesus, gives her far more than she hopes for. He invites her to sit at his table and eat bread with him. And when Ruth comes home and Naomi hears about the man who has been so kind to her, her mother-in-law exclaims, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." What comes into your mind when you think about God? That is such a vital question. Well, kindness wasn't one of the first words that came into Naomi's mind when she thought about God. She had had bitter experiences, and those experiences had impacted her view of God. Even though those experiences were a result of her family's sin. But now something has changed, and she's talking about the kindness of God. Someone has put it like this: when Naomi learns that Ruth has met up with Boaz, the sun rises again in her life. It's a great picture, isn't it? Naomi has been frozen, as it were. She's done the right thing in coming back to Bethlehem. She's acknowledged her sin. She will die among God's people. But she doesn't expect to know much in the way of blessing. But now the sun is beginning to rise again, when she thought it never would. Someone else has said, suddenly Naomi was beginning to see that the Lord wasn't out to get her. Have you had that realization that the Lord is not out to get you? In fact, he was still able and willing to smile upon her, to show her covenant faithfulness, in spite of her sin and rebellion. Naomi returns to Bethlehem thinking that she would be forever dominated and defined by her past. She has a fatalistic outlook on life, thinking that nothing is ever going to change. But as chapter 2 ends, her frozen heart is starting to melt. She's beginning to see not just future existence, but future blessing. And that is confirmed as the book ends. Chapter 4, verse 14, Then the woman said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. It's not just Naomi. So many people become old, become bitter. But here is God's blessing, and her life is nourished in her old age. Naomi thought her life was over. She thought there was no way back. She thought she would never again know God's smile and blessing on her life. But she was wrong. Gloriously, she was wrong. So having looked at Naomi, we'll come secondly to look at Ruth. And may many in our community, like Naomi, come to realize that they were wrong in thinking there was no way back for them. So Naomi, now Ruth. Remember the Moabites, the pagan child sacrificers? Well, one of them has just turned up in Bethlehem. And she doesn't know it now, but she's going to have a book of the Bible named after her. She doesn't know it now, but her name is going to appear in Jesus' family tree. Naomi had been brought up hearing about the Lord, the true God, but Ruth hadn't. She was a complete outsider. She'd never set foot in a church, and yet she becomes part of the people of God. And we see that in the passage we read earlier. Naomi has 2 daughters-in-law, not one. And when she decides to leave Moab and go back to the promised land, they're both ready to go with her. But only 2 women arrive in Bethlehem. 3 of them start the journey back, but only 2 of them make it. Just like some enthusiastically start the Christian journey, start coming to church, but they don't last. So what happens to Orpah, the other daughter-in-law? When Naomi had urged her and Ruth to count the cost, she asks both her daughters-in-law, do you really know what you're letting yourself in for? It seems counterintuitive to us. Here's Naomi with 2 family members who love her, who want to come with her. But she tries to put the brakes on, which I'm sure wasn't an easy thing to do. But she doesn't want them coming just for her sake. And at that point, one of her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah, turns around and goes home. Jesus told people to count the cost before becoming a Christian. And we need to count the cost ourselves and tell others to count the cost too. But by God's grace, one daughter-in-law was willing to count the cost. And it becomes clear that her ultimate commitment wasn't to Naomi, but to Naomi's God. At this point, Ruth utters some famous words. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And then she uses God's covenant name, his personal name, as she adds, May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. Wow, what a statement. But here's a question. How does she even know anything about the Lord? Well, it must be from Naomi. Naomi hasn't been a great example of a Christian, but she's said enough that Ruth knows about the Lord. Perhaps seeing pagan living in front of Naomi had helped her realize what they had walked away from. And she's told Ruth about a better way. And somewhere along the line, Ruth has turned from worshipping idols to serving the living and true God. And that now becomes clear. She faces the question, is she going to continue the way she's been brought up, or is she going to become a first-generation Christian? By God's grace, she puts her trust in the true and living God. Ruth is a complete outsider, but she's brought in. She finds a home among God's people, and she puts her trust in the true God. God's repeated promise to his people throughout Scripture is, I will be your God and you will be my people. And it seems like Naomi has told Ruth about it, because look at how Ruth responds. Your people shall be my people and your God my God. What did God say? What's God's invitation to those who trust in him? I will be your God and you will be my people. And Ruth responds, your people will be my people and your God my God. And that's the thing about being born again. It doesn't just give you a new God or a new relationship with God. It gives you a new people. People to watch out for you. People who have your back. And some here can testify to that. And so Christianity isn't just for those who've been brought up with it. Maybe you're interested or intrigued by Jesus or Christianity, but you haven't been brought up with it. Your life has gone in a certain direction and you think it mustn't be for you. But actually the Bible is full of outsiders who were brought in. There are only 3 women mentioned in the family tree of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, which for a Jewish genealogy, for any woman to be mentioned, is surprising in and of itself. But who these 3 women were, other than Mary, is even more surprising. Because there's Tamar, who pretended to be a prostitute. There's Bathsheba, who committed adultery. And there's Ruth. Towards the end of the book, the people of Bethlehem say to Boaz, may the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. Now, humanly speaking, Ruth wasn't anything like Rachel and Leah. She wasn't anything like those famous names in the history of God's people, the mothers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Humanly speaking, Ruth wasn't anything like them. She was a foreigner. She had worshipped other gods. But what defined her wasn't how her life had been lived up to that point. What defined her was how her life finished. I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but it's a good illustration. A few years ago, there was a big Iron Brew advert at Glasgow Airport, and it said, it's not about where you're going, it's about where you're from. It's not about where you're going, it's about where you're from. But the message of the Bible is the opposite. It's not about where you're from, it's about where you're going. It's not about where you were born or the advantages or disadvantages you had. It's not about who your family were. It's not about how you've lived life up to this point. It's not about where you're from. It's about where you're going. If you came here tonight on the outside, it's not too late to be on the inside. And so here we have 2 women whose lives completely change. One had grown up knowing God, but she'd gone away from him. Her life had turned out very differently from what she imagined it would. She wondered if she would ever smile again, but God wasn't finished with her yet. The other grew up not believing anything about God. And yet she encountered a believer, a very flawed believer, just like those of us here tonight who are Christians. But Naomi said and did enough to point her daughter-in-law to the true God. And the Lord used that. So 2 women from very different backgrounds, two women of very different ages, yet both find faith. And what's the common thread? Or rather, who's the common thread? Well, it's Boaz, the man who points us to Jesus. Once they meet him, their lives change. Once he comes into their lives will never be the same again. Boaz is willing to pay the price to redeem Ruth, even though it comes at great cost to himself. It's a price that others weren't willing to pay. Just like Jesus would pay the ultimate price for all who trust in him. And Jesus is changing lives today across the world. People have gone their own way, but it hasn't brought happiness. People are looking for meaning, looking for purpose. And if the Bible is right when it says that we were made to know God, then we'll only find meaning and purpose when we come to Jesus. Amen. Well, we sing as we close the final song on the sheet, Psalm 116. How does someone respond when their life changes? Well, someone's life can change outwardly without them becoming a believer. But if their heart is truly changed, they'll respond by saying, as the opening line here says, I love the Lord. Not just that I love him because of what he and the church have done for me, but I love him because of who he is. So Psalm 116, these 6 verses on the sheet, if you're able, we'll stand to sing.